I welcome you to the course Environmental Issues. Today we'll be discussing the topic Threats to Biodiversity. The most unique feature of Earth is the existence of life, and the most extraordinary feature of life is its diversity. Approximately 9 million types of plants, animals, fungi, and other microorganisms inhabit the Earth. The human actions were supposedly responsible for dismantling the Earth's ecosystems, eliminating the genes, species at an alarming rate. This observation led to the question of how such loss of biological diversity will alter the functioning of ecosystems and also their ability to provide ecosystem services. The second important question is that what are the main drivers of biodiversity loss? So, to address these two questions, today's discussion will be talking about the drivers of biodiversity, what are the causes of biodiversity loss, and we'll be trying to talk about the strategies to mitigate the biodiversity loss. The process of speciation, that is formation of new species, and extinction is a part and parcel of the natural evolution process. In the past, we have seen 5 mass extinctions during Ordovician period, Devonian period, Permian period, Triassic and Cretaceous period. There were 5 mass extinctions in the geological past. The prominent one was the Permian period extinction, mass extinction. So during this Permian period, more than 75% of land dwelling animal species were extinct, and it was very major extinction. In fact, that led to a mass the species were removed, and that has led to a lot of harm to the environment. All the processes, ecosystem processes, services, and also there is a lot of cycling of nutrients and many processes, ecological processes. Even the evolution processes is depend on the biodiversity, and these all actions, the services were affected because of the mass extinction. The main reasons for the last 5 mass extinction, if you look at it, one is the foremost important thing is the volcanic eruption. The second important thing is the change of climatic condition. The third important thing is that the asteroid or collisions, that is the third reason. And fourth important reason is the massive release of methane gas. These were the 4 important reasons why mass extinction has taken place in the past. When you look at the rate of mass extinction, that is, in fact, it's phenomenal. But the present day, if you look at it, there is a lot of difference. When you look at the present day extinction rate, it is much higher than the background extinction rate. And the main reason is that the present day mass extinction is caused because of human actions. When you look at the current extinction rate, is almost 100 to 1000 times greater than the background extinction rate. The background extinction rate is also very equally important, because the formation of species, extinction of species, it is very much part of the natural life cycle. It's a part of the natural process. So, but when you look at the present day extinction rate, it is phenomenal, and this definitely will have a lot of effect on the ecosystem and also for the environment as such. The human actions, how they have caused the loss of biodiversity, this is a very important question. And the first noticeable effect of human beings, their action on biodiversity, was the elimination of large mammals in 2 important continents. One is the Australia, the other one is the America. In these 2 continents, the human actions has led to the extinction of mammals, mammoth mammals whose weight is more than 44 kg. So this is a very unique symptom, or in other words, imprint of human actions. And the human action, particularly hunting process, clearing forest, burning forest, these actions, human actions, has led to the extinction of mammoth organisms. Now let us see what are the threats to biodiversity. The first and foremost important threat to biodiversity is habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation and degradation. This is the foremost important threat to biodiversity. The second important thing is the overexploitation of species. Third is the predation, competition and displacement of indigenous species by invasive species. The fourth important reasons for biodiversity loss is disease outbreak. The fifth threat to biodiversity is climate change. It's a very significant thing because this climate change can have a synergistic effect with other drivers of biodiversity loss. This climate change can limit the species distribution. So, climate change alters the geographical location of suitable conditions, favorable conditions like climate niche for many species. So, it is a form of habitat destruction. And also very importantly, this climate change can have a far-reaching consequences on almost all the organisms on the earth surface. When you look at the interaction between climate change and biodiversity, there is possibly three important interactions will be there. The changing climatic condition can affect the organisms, drastically it can affect, and in order to address that issue, the organisms can either migrate to a newer location. The second important thing, it can adapt itself to the changing climatic condition. Third is it has to extinct because it has to die. So, these three all the possible outcomes of the climate change interaction or climate change impact on the biodiversity. When you look at the vulnerability of the present day biodiversity to climate change is basically because of the species habitat. When you look at the habitat, if it is very, very small habitat, then it will be harboring a very small population, and the genetic diversity will be very much less, and the evolutionary potential also will be very, very low. So, in this case, in case of a small habitat, the organisms will have less capability to adapt. On the other hand, if the habitat is fragmented, habitat fragmented, so that will prevent the species to migrate to other locations. So, these are very, very important aspects of vulnerability of the species to climate change. Now, if you see, there are a lot of examples of the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. For instance, erosion of lizard diversity. The second important example was the extinction of Australian great reef rodent. It's a very good organism that were extinct because of climate change. And also we can see that because of climate change, the pollinating insects and animals, the population of it has started declining because of climate change. When you look at the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, there are three important impacts. One is the changes in the natural calendars, or in other words phenology of plants and animals. The second important thing is the changes in the species distribution, the second important impact. The third important thing is the fundamental changes in the ecosystems. So, these three are the symptoms of climate change on biodiversity, and that in a way talks about how climate change can lead to extinction of species also. Now, let us see the first impact, that is the phenology part. There is a lot of changes in the phenology of plants and animal behavior. In fact, in case of the plant, if you see in many of the plants, early flowering is observed, and that is an indication of dismantling of the ecosystem, or in other words, the functioning of the ecosystem, the crop ecosystem has been affected because of climate change. When you see, when a plant is going for early flowering, the production and productivity of the plants will be reduced severely. The second important example as far as the phenology of plants and animal behavior is concerned is the nesting and egg laying behavior in the case of tree swallows that has been observed, and this is severely disrupted because of climate change. Third important thing is that even the migration pattern, there is a time scale, and in case of migration also, that also has been disrupted because of climate change. So, now let us talk about the second aspect of the impact of climate change on biodiversity. The second thing is the species distribution. When you talk about species distribution, the most prominent observation was the Aedes checker spot butterfly. The population of Aedes checker spot butterfly declined alarmingly in the North America, and in fact their population started shifting upward in both in the altitude and in latitude also. And this is a very significant symptom of climate change on biodiversity. The second example is the sooty copper. It's again a butterfly in Europe. In fact, their population that has been observed in the northern part of Europe, slowly and steadily, this what you call this sooty copper butterfly, it started moving northwards. That shows that the temperature is getting warmer in the European region. And in fact, this sooty copper butterfly, it has been observed in the Estonia. Estonia is a country in the northern part of Europe. Third example of the species distribution is the eelgrass. Eelgrass that has been observed in the northern part of North America because of the changing climatic condition. Now let us discuss about the effect of climate change on the ecosystems. At the ecosystem level, what will happen to the organisms? The most important example is the cloud forest. The Costa Rica is a country in the Central American country, Costa Rica. In that country, the cloud forest is very, very famous. Monteverde cloud forest is very, very famous tropical rainforest. And this rainforest, takes up the moisture from the cloud. So because of the climatic condition, changing climatic condition, the dry days have been observed, and what happened? The cloud formation was in the higher altitudes. So that is also an effect that is caused on the cloud forest. The second important example is the golden tod of Monteverde again, and that has been extinct because of the climatic condition. The third important example as far as the ecosystem is concerned is the coral reefs. It's a very interesting system. Coral reef ecosystem is very interesting because their formation is dependent on the sea surface temperature. You only under certain latitudes you will be finding these coral reefs, because the temperature is a very, very prominent requirement. The third important thing is that it requires very good water. It should not be silted. So these three are very, very important requirement for the coral reefs to exist. And there is a symbiotic relationship between the coral organism, the animal, and the algae. There is a very symbiotic, interdependent relationship between these two organisms. That is an uniqueness of the coral reef ecosystem. And the second aspect of the coral reef ecosystem is that it is rich in productivity. As far as the productivity is concerned, it is in fact it's an habitat for many, many organisms. So that is the reason why coral reef ecosystem is very, very important, significant one. And because of the increase in the surface air temperature and also the sea surface temperature, ocean acidification process, the symbiotic relationship between the coral animal and the algae is affected. Because of this reason, the coral reef is bleached, and this is again a symptom of climate change, and this also a cause of concern, because that can lead to the loss of many, many organisms, because the coral reef ecosystem in fact it's an habitat for many organisms. Next one, as far as the ecosystem is concerned, the Arctic ecosystem is a very unique one, because Arctic ice is again it is the habitat for many organisms, whether it is a polar bear, many birds are dependent on this Arctic ice ecosystem. Because of the changing climatic condition, the ice mass in the Arctic region that is reduced, both in terms of the volume, in terms of the thickness, it is reduced. And this is a very, very important thing, because it is causing a lot of effect on the diversity, polar diversity, particularly the polar bear, and also the many, many bird species. They are dependent on certain organisms in the Arctic region. See, when you talk about the bird species, they are dependent on Arctic cod. It's a very good, it's a fish. It is basically it thrives in the edges of the Arctic ice, mass. It is there, and because of the changing dynamics in the Arctic region, because of climate change, the availability of Arctic cord has been disrupted, and because of this reason, the their bird species, they are, which are dependent on the Arctic cord, they will be highly vulnerable. Next one is the best example is the nesting seabirds. It's a very unique thing, because this nesting seabirds, it will fly from the land mass and it will go to the edges of the ice, Arctic ice, to feed and get the feed for their young ones. So this is a very important thing, because if the Arctic ice mass, if it is reduced in shrinking size, and it starts shrinking, the migratory birds or these birds has to travel a very long distance. For each trip they has to make a long distance to feed their younger ones. So look at it, how important the ecosystem is that, because many organisms are dependent on each other, and if anything happens to one organism, that can have a far reaching effect on other organisms. As far as the effect of climate change is concerned, it's very difficult to predict, because if you see the effect impact, if you look at it, it is not linear, it's not gradual. That is the reason why the prediction is more complicated as far as the climate change impact on the biodiversity loss is concerned. It's a very difficult thing. And also when you look at the effects of climate change on the other parts of the other ecosystems, like even water ecosystem, hydrological cycle, so it is having a multitude of dimensions. So it's very difficult to figure out or predict exactly how much the climate change can have an effect on the biodiversity. But nevertheless, it is playing a very important role, because it is having a synergistic effect with other drivers of biodiversity loss. Second important aspect, or the drivers apart from climate change, habitat destruction, is invasive species. These invasive species are in fact they are introduced species, invasive species, that increase in abundance at the cost of the native species. So this invasive species, what they can do, they can displace the native species, and they can prey upon the native species for what? For the resources. So they can do this thing. Either it can displace or prey upon the native species, and also they can alter the habitat. And through this process, the invasive species will be thriving in a new ecosystem, and they will be trying to affect the native population. So when the invasive species enters into a new ecosystem, it will not be having any predators, parasites. So there is no natural control, biological control will not be there. The second important thing is that these species, exotic species or invasive species, they will be entering into a new environment. That new environment will be made favorable for them, either because of the human beings, or because they have their own capability to extract the resources and thrive upon even the whatever the resources they have it. So they have reproduction abilities, they can extract and utilize the resources in a more effective manner, and they have a flexible behavior. So that is the reason why these invasive species can have a drastic effect on the native species. See, we can visualize the effect of invasive species on organisms through focusing on few ecosystems. For instance, if you focus the effect of invasive species on island ecosystem, what will happen? See, the island ecosystem is a very unique one, because it's very isolated and they have their own endemic species. So in that case, if an invasive species enters into the island ecosystem, what kind of effect it can have? It will be very significant effect will be there, because the native species is endemic in nature, it's few in number, the population is less, and so their genetic base is very narrow, and they have their own limitations. Own limitations are there. And when you look at the defense mechanisms, that is also very limited. They have a less of a genetic base and limited defense capacity, and they lack natural immunities also. So because of that reason, these endemic species are more vulnerable for the attack of the invasive species. And there are many examples are there. For best example is the brown tree snake in Pacific Islands. Their introduction has caused a lot of harm to the environment, particularly in the Pacific Islands. So let us see another ecosystem, aquatic habitats. You know that the fish have been many times it has been introduced both intentionally and also unintentionally. When you talk about intentionally, to increase the fish population, fish production and productivity, because that is it meets the protein demand of the human beings. So it has been introduced by the human beings, and this introduction by the human beings has caused a lot of harm to the native species, and there are many examples are there. For instance, the Nile perch it has been introduced into Lake Victoria in Africa. So there's a good examples are there. The second one is that unintentionally also it can be introduced, whether if you construct a canal and if you clean up the ship, that also can lead to introduction of fish population to a newer environment. So these invasive species in case of aquatic ecosystems is also a major concern. There are many examples are there as far as the invasive species in aquatic habitats are concerned. For I just now I talked about the nail perch, zebra mussel in that has been introduced in the Great Lakes of North America, and in many cases if you would have you've seen for ourselves that the aquatic organisms, the ornamental species have been introduced, and later stages it has become more of invasive in nature, invasive thing. When you talk about the invasive species with other drivers of biodiversity loss, there are major differences there. So when you talk about the invasive species, they establish themselves in a better way in a new environment due to a lot of inherent capacities. The second important reason is that they immediately will build up their numbers. The population will increase and they will start using the resources more effectively, and in the process they can displace the native population. And once they establish, it's very difficult to control it. It's a lot of mechanisms, a lot of approaches, strategies are required to get rid of the invasive species, and definitely it is a very cost intensive exercise. So in that way, invasive species can lead to a lot of harm to the biodiversity, particularly the native species. On the other hand, other threats, the habitat degradation or habitat fragmentation, the pollution problems, these threats can be corrected. This can be corrected because if you take suitable measures, it can be corrected, and as long as there is a original species, that is of course it's a very important thing. But there is a possible, when you talk about the potential of correction, it is very much possible in these kind of threats. But invasive species is very difficult to contain. Another thing is that when you talk about the climate change, it's a very significant thing. As I said, that it is having a lot of synergistic effect with other drivers of biodiversity loss. And this climate change, if you wanted the impacts, if you wanted to control on biodiversity particularly, then you have to take all the steps possible. We have to look for the co-benefits, and we need to look for certain strategies that can help the organisms to thrive in extreme environments. You have to give elbow space in fact to the organisms to adapt itself to the changing climatic condition, and lot of measures, the conservation measures has to be taken, whether it's an ex situ conservation or in situ conservation has to be taken. Even ecosystem approaches is required to conserve the biodiversity. Now, we have discussed about the drivers of biodiversity loss. We need to talk about the consequences of biodiversity loss as well to exactly understand the gravity of the situation. The most important consequence of biodiversity loss is that the evolution process, that itself will be disrupted because of loss of biodiversity. The second important thing is that for the existence of ecosystem, for the sustenance of ecosystem, for the health of the ecosystem, for the stability of the ecosystem, biodiversity is essential, because this biodiversity will be providing a lot of resilience capacity to the ecosystem, whether whatever ecosystem we are talking about, agro ecosystem or aquatic ecosystem or island ecosystem. So in every ecosystem, the resilience capacity is because of the biodiversity. More rich in biodiversity, definitely the ecosystem will be resilient in nature, and this is a very significant point. This ecosystem will be disrupted to the extent possible that all the ecological processes will be affected because of the loss of biodiversity. In fact, when you look at the consequences of biodiversity loss versus the ecosystem functioning, ecosystem by itself is having a lot of unique functions. One is the niche complementarity, the other one is the insurance effect. So these two effects are miserably affected because of the loss of biodiversity. And also, if you look at it, because of the loss of one particular organism's species, if it is a keystone species, that can have a cascading effect on other species also. That's a very, very significant loss to the environment. So to sum it up, today we have discussed how important the biodiversity is, what are the drivers of biodiversity loss, and we have just talked about the most important driver, that is the habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation. Second important thing is that we have talked about how pollution can have an effect on the biodiversity loss. Third important aspect is the invasive species, and the fourth one is the climate change. So we discussed these drivers of biodiversity loss, and we have also mentioned about the difficulty that we are experiencing in predicting the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. We have discussed also about in detail, we have discussed about the invasive species, how the threat because of invasive species is different from other threats, what kind of methodology, what kind of strategies that we need to adopt to address the issue of invasive species. And very importantly, we need to train the citizens. When you talk about the conservation aspect, we need to train the citizens to so that they will be taking a very proactive steps to conserve the biodiversity. Thank you very much.